Good morning, everyone. What I want to do is talk you through today some interesting opportunities and developments that we're seeing coming out of all the location data that is now emerging because all of these devices are location enabled, which is very different than a couple of years ago when we first started this. In fact, today in the front page of the journal is a big article about smartphone trackers raise privacy worries. And so this is something that we did this workshop 2 years ago. No one really was concerned about because none of the devices were really that locatable. And we've come a long way now that we now have people in Washington worried about whether we're starting to intrude on people's privacy. So we're trying to be cognizant of all that, but there are also some great opportunities around all that. So just a minute or two on who we are, if you don't know who Skyhook is. We're a location technology company. We have a core location engine that powers some 100 million devices around the world today. What we've done is actually combine signals from GPS satellites, cell towers, and a technique that we created using Wi-Fi access points. In fact, 7 years ago, we sat down with Professor Polygon here at WPI talking about this concept. And could it be possible to actually use these signals of opportunity to put in place a commercial-grade location system? And how could you possibly take advantage of signals that you don't control and that are moving all the time? And what you've seen now is some 6, 7 years later, we're now on all these devices around the world. All the major consumer electronics companies are looking at adding Wi-Fi location. And today we handle over 300 million location requests every single day. Now, one of the ways we actually collect all this data, which was pretty unique, is we actually drive. We've had thousands of people get in cars with specialized equipment, and they drive up and down every street of our coverage area. And so we've physically gone out and collected all this data. And so some of you may have learned more about this recently as it's come in the news, as Google has been trying to do the same thing and had a little bit of a boo-boo along the way. So some interesting stats from the last 5 or 6 years. We've driven over 10 million miles of road in the world. We've had thousands of drivers, folks who will drive for a couple of weeks for us and scan for these signals, or some that drive year-round. We've collected close to 250 million access points around the world in their exact locations. We've also done the same for cell towers so that we can now combine cell tower, Wi-Fi, and GPS together. Just an incredible amount of data from the scanning operation, but more interestingly, data that's now coming off the devices. It tells us a whole lot about how these devices are being used, where they're being used, and how people are actually behaving in their lives. So interesting in that this is exactly what Google has been trying to do. They saw the success that we were having, and they certainly saw us in all their major device makers and their Android accounts, and so they began driving as well and equipping their Street View camera cars for Wi-Fi and cell tower signal tracking as well. The problem is they didn't do it right. And what they did was accidentally collect private network data, which is a really bad thing to do, and now got themselves in hot water across major countries around the world. But the point is, this was them trying to build a location system using ambient Wi-Fi. It just shows how important this is that they'd be willing to go out and make that kind of an effort. But the real reason we're doing all this is we focus primarily to date on consumer applications. We think it does apply across industrial, fleet management applications, and certainly a bunch of government opportunities. But for the first part of this market, the consumer market has been the most attractive just because of the sheer number of units. And what we've been hoping for, and even 2 years ago we were never sure about, is would consumers care? We knew that people like to use maps and navigation, but what else? This is something that really become an integral part of how they use these mobile devices. And I'm happy to say here today, just 2 years later, the answer is very much a yes. In fact, when we were here 2 years ago, it was about 2 weeks before the iPhone App Store opened up. So at that point, this whole idea of an app market didn't exist. This whole idea of app makers, and thousands, some now 200,000 individual apps that have been launched. Back then, there was none. And we were pondering about just, would this take off? Would people care? And I think 2 years later, it's pretty obvious that mobile applications is emerging as an enormous market. In terms of location apps, is something we track. When we started this 2 years ago, there was a handful. It was just maps on the phone and maybe local search. Now there's close to 10,000 apps across the iPhone, Android, BlackBerry, et cetera, that use location. And this is just phenomenal. We could never dreamed of 10,000 different ideas, and they range from very functional things like getting from A to B to very wacky things like social networking to even bizarre things like UFO tracking. And so it's just amazing to see the richness of this community. And what we're starting to see now is less and less physical applications about how to get from A to B and where things are, but more using your location as your context. So I'm listening to a song, actually tag the location of this song I like. And what that does is I can now say, what else are people listening to around me? What are the top 10 songs today in New York City? What books are people reading in San Francisco? Things that really have nothing to do with your physical location, but where you are tells a whole lot about your behaviors. And so we expect this number to go from 10,000 to 50,000 over the course of this year. But now that we're getting these apps out there, we're starting to see a really interesting amount of data come off the devices that we've never seen before. And so at Skyhook, we're spending a lot of time trying to figure out what this means, what new opportunities are there, what can we do better in terms of building a location system, but what more can we learn about human behavior. And so the first step that folks talk about is advertising, and this is very, very early. Articles like you see in the journal are more concern than they are reality. There's actually there's very few location-based ad campaigns going on today. This is an example of one of them on the iPhone where as you're driving around, you'll see an ad from some hotel chain telling you where the nearest hotel is and how to get there and make a reservation. Pretty straightforward stuff, but this is kind of groundbreaking in the advertising world. Advertisers have never had this potential, and it scares them a bit. They're not quite sure how to use it. I actually think advertisers are more scared of this than regulators and consumers, just because they've never had to think in this way of figuring out where people are and how to market differently. But we're just starting to see some of this, and it's very interesting, and folks are more in the pilot stage of it. But where we are is a little bit further out, because we're a technology company. We're trying to think how this is going to be used 2 to 3 years out. And some of the things we're starting to learn from the devices is just a lot about human behavior. Again, we handle over 300 million location requests every day. So that, just put it in the right context, that's 300 million times someone presses the button, where am I? That's not someone tracking through a 2-hour drive. That is somebody hitting the button with their thumb 300 million times a day. That's the way the iPhone works. You have to proactively say where I am. And so it tells us a lot about that. And so we're starting to develop this data that says how different a place like San Francisco is in the morning from the night. Obviously, the red zones are the more intense usage where there's a whole bunch more users. Green is where it's later. And we can start to look at this throughout the course of the day and see things like traffic patterns and see how people aggregate. We can see in different event type scenarios. It's really fascinating stuff for now from a visual standpoint. And we're trying to think of what applications can take advantage of this. So this didn't come across, unfortunately, when we copied it, but this is a heat map of New York, and we have a bunch of these on our website if you want to take a look at them. But it'll show the movements of people throughout the day and different areas of intensity. Midtown Manhattan during the middle of the day, during rush hour. Then it gets real kind of quiet, and as it gets into the late evening, the village gets very happening. And then at 2 a.m., there's one street corner that's the hottest place in New York, and that's just because there's a bunch of clubs down there. And you can see those kind of things, and we're trying to figure out what is it we can learn from all this. And again, it's across the world. And it's very hard to use this much data and say exactly what is going on unless you actually physically get out there and you watch it yourself. And so we're trying to think of what industries now can take advantage of this and find use of it. And so what we've done is we've exposed this data through a new service called SpotRank. And what we've done is just allow this data open to app developers, advertisers, government agencies, really anyone who wants to analyze and use this data in some way. We figured that we're going to spend a bunch of time working on it ourselves, but why not let the world help us figure it out? And so SpotRank's a service that any app developer, any individual or corporation can now have access to, and it'll tell you a little bit about what's happening around you or in different places of the world. And so the things we've started to look at are, what events happen that make the usage different. The data is very, very predictable. What we found is that on Tuesday at 3 p.m., next Tuesday at 3 p.m. is going to look very similar. The Tuesday after that, etc. Human behavior is very, very consistent. But there are also events that happen that fall outside that 90%. And so we're trying to use it. Is that something we can tell when things are happening? Maybe in a major crisis, we can tell it's happening before anybody else. Could we help city planners plan for things like the new Boston Marathon? So this is the finish line of the Boston Marathon on a typical Monday, and this is the Boston Marathon during the race. This is the same place during the race. And so you can see, obviously, there's intensity around the racetrack. What was more interesting was what happened after the race finished. You could actually watch people filter outside the racetrack, race area, and go into different bars and restaurants all over the city. And then eventually you watch them spill into all the T-stops as they went home. And so it's really interesting to watch that, and I think it tells us a lot about how they maybe can set up public transportation or how advertisers can take advantage of this. But it's really fascinating information because no one's ever been able to track this many users at this level of precision. So some of the things we're doing, just to give you a flavor for it, we're talking to the folks in the retail world. So I've got 8 stores in Manhattan. How do I figure out where to put the 9th one? What they do today is they actually track cars that go by once a year. Someone sits there, physically tracks the cars with the counter. And that's how most stores are decided where to put them. We think it's more interesting to know exactly where people are at different times of the day. And so we're sitting down with retailers and comparing against their store traffic against what we see outside their store. And we're also trying to compare it against how much money they make in that store on a typical day. And ranking, for example, the Rite Aid stores in New York City based on the traffic near their store through that period of time. And so we could pretty much bet that this store did a whole lot more business than this one, without ever having to know anything about what they were selling that day or anything about their store receipts. We just know there were that many people around the store that day, and more than likely they wandered into the Rite Aid. This is data that retailers have never had before, and we're spending a lot of time with it. They don't know what to do with it, but we try to help them figure it out. Another example is outdoor advertising. Folks who run billboards and now do the side of buses, and train stops, and even bathrooms have no idea how many people look at their ad on a daily basis. And so it's very hard for them to turn an advertiser and say, I can serve you up this demographic in this community, because they really don't know. And the only way they do know is once a year someone stands under the billboard and counts cars that go by. We think it's more interesting to know exactly how many people are in the vicinity of that particular billboard, and maybe even looking at it at that time. And so some of the things we're doing is helping them weight different billboard locations based on who's there. They now have digital billboards where the ad can change. And maybe you can change the ad based on the type of people that are in front of that billboard at a particular time. You can charge more when there's a greater audience in front of it. All this stuff scares the hell out of billboard companies because they've never had to really care. They just charge the same for all the billboard locations. And so the advertisers are very interested in this because they spend a lot of money and they want to get a better return on this than just putting up banner ads or putting up TV spots. If they know the type of person looking up at their advertisement, that's gold to them, and that's what we're trying to help them figure out. And some of the other things we're working on is finding spots where there probably should be an advertisement. So this is the hottest spot in terms of density of our devices in Manhattan on the Lower East Side. And what it is it's a subway stop. And it's people coming up out of the subway and they open up their phone and they're looking for something. They're trying to find a store, find a friend, get directions, etc. So they're all looking at a device and they're all seeking something out. And you come to the top of the subway stop, there's nothing there. There's a gap there, and it's a structure they're working on. They don't realize it's probably the most valuable advertising real estate in the world, certainly in New York City, and there's nothing there. And it's just they just don't know that many people are at that point looking for something to do. And so maybe this is where you can find a better place to put advertisements that are more relevant. We're also doing some things that should try and highlight this human behavior by focusing on particular events. So this past weekend was the Country Music Association's annual awards. So they have a big festival in Nashville. And so we worked with the CMA to cover all of their venues. And what we did was we tied together not only the concert activities, but also all the Twitter messages that were geotagged around there, Flickr images, as well as anyone checking in on Foursquare. We overlaid those all together with our spot rec data. And so you can see this is the main concert stage, and you can see when Danny Goki got on stage how the activity picked up, and you can see what people were saying about him. but you can compare the amount of activity while he was on stage versus some of the other performers. And then you can also see where they went after the event with different bars and restaurants they went into. And so it's a showcase of it. I mean, there's no dollars exchanging hands here, but it's a way to say we have now a different look and a different view in events and activities. Lastly, one of the things we're doing is working with Major League Baseball. They're very interested in taking advantage of the fact that there are 30, 40,000 people sitting in the stands watching a game. And what you're seeing more and more is people are using their phones during the game to keep up with scores, but they're also doing things like checking in on Foursquare. So if you go to Fenway Park at a game at any given time, you'll check in, there'll be 100 other people there on Foursquare. So they check in, but then they don't do anything. And it's kind of, hey, I've checked in at Fenway Park, but what they don't realize is that now you need people to start interacting together. And Major League Baseball gets that, and they're adding to their app that you check into a ballpark, and you can now play trivia games with other people in the stands, fantasy leagues that happen on the spot. You can bet on what the next pitch is going to be, a curveball or a fastball. All these activities to try and keep you engaged with the game is what they're going to be rolling out. And what they've given us is special access to go in and literally scan every foot we can get into in every ballpark in the U.S. And so we've had someone walk through, and these are just readings we picked up as we walk through all the luxury boxes, all through the bullpen and the batting cage to make sure wherever they go, the Major League Baseball app works as accurate as possible, because the more accuracy they have, the more games they can play and the more interesting things they can do. And so this is something you'll start to see Major League Baseball roll out. We think it's pretty innovative stuff. Lastly, one of the things we're trying to do, and it certainly goes to the heart of that article, is we're trying to learn about people and where they are. The thing about our system is it's completely anonymous. We don't know anything about devices or users, which is great from a privacy standpoint, because whenever we keep everything open, we say this is how we collect data, and this is what we have, and so we don't get in the kind of trouble that Google and others get into. The downside is we don't know who you are and what you're doing, and that's the real value for marketers. And so we're spending a lot of time trying to mine this data and look at ways at an anonymous aggregate level we can apply demographics about the type of people that are in that particular area and where they go throughout the day. So that when I show you that intense spot in Manhattan, I can tell you 30% of those are of this demographic, another 40% are of this demographic. And if I can do that without violating privacy, I have a tremendous asset that folks now know where human beings are and what they're doing, and then we can better target promotion and advertising. I think that's about it. I'd be glad to take any questions, or we'll just wait for the panel.
We've got a few minutes.
Okay.
Any questions for Ted? If I could just start, Ted, and you started your presentations talking about 2 years ago, very few apps have this, and now we're at tens of thousands. On the flip side, there seems to be an emerging challenge for the application developer community around the economics. You're seeing Apple's App Store having so many applications. How do they differentiate that? And then all of them are migrating to a free model. So it's kind of early enthusiasm and now a lot of challenges around the economics, which I guess if it's not solved could dampen some of the development. So how do you see the economics of the developer community, the challenge there? Does that cause some kind of slowdown as this market rationalizes itself? Do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think obviously not everyone's going to be successful and make money on 240,000 apps, but it is still early. I mean, this is from 0 to where we are today in just 2 years. I mean, I don't think there's been any other technology market that's grown at this pace. What we're starting to see is really interesting early trends where paid downloads are starting to make money. So we know a whole host of application developers that now have 1 million downloads of a paid app, who are upgrading people to a $10 premium version. We're just seeing people with 10 million users. And that's phenomenal for a year or two at a time. And so that's starting to drag in some of this advertising. I think Apple's efforts, Google's efforts to make it a better ad system will help a ton. That part is very early. And so no one's making enough money to pay the bills yet purely on mobile advertising. But that number is going up every single day, and Apple and Google's influence brings in the advertisers who spend a whole lot more. And so I would say, if somebody had to decide today, they probably would be able to survive just on these two. But based on the growth we're seeing over the next year or two, there's going to be a tremendous amount of way to make money. If you can get to a 5-10 million user base, you're going to make a bunch of money in this area.
Great. Any other questions for Ted?
Yes, hi. Basically, you're based on Wi-Fi data. What do you see when standards are evolving? We have the HE, gig, LTE, and already have Femto getting into WCD9. Are you doing similar things to those small cells?
Yeah, I think at a high level, we're trying to use signals of opportunity, as we've always talked about. If there's something out there that we can lock down in a physical place, we'll use it as a reference point. The reality is right now, there's nothing better than Wi-Fi. The numbers are just phenomenal, and they continue to grow. I mean, we can remember we were pretty excited when we scanned our millionth access point. But now there's 240 million around the world. And that just continues to go at this exponential rate. So I think if femtocells started to show that growth, we would use those. We're actually starting to do some work in WiMAX for positioning. And as LTE emerges, we'll use them all. But the reality is the core of it is going to be Wi-Fi and GPS for a very long time.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. I think we'll have to hold questions. Chasing Ted down here. So for our last presenter, welcome up Martin Fierstein, CTO of Skyhook Wireless. Thanks, Martin.